The Scream by Norwegian artist Edvard Munch is one of the most iconic images in art. An unsettling, unnerving picture that draws you right into the tortured soul of the artist, whilst at the same time reflecting the universal and overwhelming angst of the modern age.
Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graeme Yorston, and this is the first of a new series of videos on works of art that have something important to say about mental health. But where could I start if not with The Scream? It has been studied, discussed, interpreted, and repurposed 1,000 times. An image that has become such a familiar part of popular culture, and yet one that still manages to remain as fresh and elusive as when it was created 130 years ago.
Edvard Munch was 29 years old when he painted The Scream in 1893, in an incredibly productive period following the death of his overbearing father. Like many of his major works, it exists in several different versions, as Munch likes to revisit his subjects throughout his long life. There is a pastel version, probably a preparatory sketch, and another pastel from 1895, which broke records when it sold for almost $120 million in 2012. Munch also created a lithograph stone and produced around 50 prints from it, some of which he hand-coloured. And he made a final painting in tempera and oil on cardboard in 1910, in a more optimistic period after spending 8 months in a private mental hospital. The first version was painted in Berlin and the small coastal town of Åsgårdstrand, which was a popular summer retreat for a number of Norwegian artists and the backdrop for Munch's first love affair. It was first exhibited in Berlin at the end of 1893 with the German title Der Schrei der Natur, The Scream of Nature, with 6 other paintings which would later form part of his ambitious Frieze of Life cycle, along with some other earlier works. Dark and brooding, the paintings portray pain and tragedy, including the death of his beloved sister Sophie, the torment of his doomed relationship with Millie Taulo, and the bored but ready for business expression of ladies of the night, Rosa and Amelie. When The Scream was first shown in Norway 2 years later, it did not go down well, provoking strong criticism and public speculation about the state of Munch's sanity. Art critic and museum director Henrik Grosch wrote that Munch could no longer be considered a serious man with a normal brain. Another visitor, however, Henrik Ibsen, was more positive. He particularly liked The Woman in 3 Stages, and reassured Munch that the more enemies he made, the more friends he would gather. And when the painting was exhibited in Copenhagen in 1904, 11 years after its creation, a faint pencil inscription was noticed: "Could only have been painted by a madman." For a long time it was thought this might have been scribbled by a critic or disgruntled gallery visitor, but infrared examination showed the comment was added by Munch himself, probably in response to its negative reception in Norway. But it was the lithograph version that first became known outside Norway, appearing in the French periodical La Revue Blanche in 1895 and a New York art magazine, Mamselle, the following year. Munch, though, remained relatively unknown internationally until the 1950s, when several of his paintings, including The Scream, were sent on an extended multi-city tour of the USA, Brazil, Britain, France and Italy. At the same time, the first major English-language studies of his work appeared, all of which coincided with the emergence of atomic age angst about what life was about, where was it all going, and what role did the individual have in this scary new world. In 1961, the scream appeared on the front cover of Time magazine in connection with an article about guilt and anxiety. And since then, it seems to have been on just about every vaguely arty student's t-shirt and coffee mug.
But what was going through the artist's mind when he loaded up his brushes with paint in 1893?
We get some idea from the poem he wrote on the frame of the later pastel version. I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting. Suddenly, the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leant on the fence. There was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends walked on, and I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature.
Now, I don't know about you, but as an explanation, I find this opens up more questions than it answers.
The exact spot where he was walking with his friends has been located in Ekeberg, a suburb of Oslo, which at this point was still known as Christiania. And it isn't a bridge or pier that they're walking along, as it first seems, but a park overlooking the city. And he wasn't in the city at the time, so he is painting his recollection of the scene, a memory he first refers to in a diary entry made when he was in Nice in the south of France more than a year earlier. His first attempts at capturing the scene looked rather different. Interesting, but less powerful. But the figure gradually becomes more anonymous and sexless, barely human, yet somehow universal, and turns to the viewer to share its pain, allowing everyone, regardless of age, gender, or cultural background, to see something of themselves.
Now that's a powerful image. But what does it mean?
One interpretation is that the picture is the recollection of a panic attack. But I'm not convinced by this. Panic attacks are unpleasant. They can make a person feel they're going to die at any moment. But they're not normally accompanied by the despair that is at the heart of this picture. Closer, I think, is the suggestion that it is a representation of the intense dysphoria, distorted perceptions, and strange out-of-body experiences of someone who might nowadays be diagnosed with depersonalization, derealization disorder. Another theory is that the foreboding red sky in the background is the artist's memory of the Krakatoa volcanic eruption of 1883, which caused deep red sunsets in much of the world for several months a decade earlier.
But I'm not convinced by this either, as it doesn't explain the main subject of the picture, just the background.
Another explanation for the red skies is that they are high-altitude nacreous clouds which occur in northern skies in cold weather and reflect the light in a particularly vivid way.
Well, yes, possibly. But again, this just explains the sky, and this isn't a picture about a pretty sunset.
Another suggestion is that it was Munch's response to being near the asylum in which his sister Laura was a patient for many years. But she was treated in Gaustadt Hospital on the other side of the city. Yet another is that it was inspired by a Peruvian mummy shown at the 1889 World's Fair in Paris. This mummy deeply affected another artist, Paul Gauguin, and appeared in 20 or more of his paintings. But although Munch must have visited the exposition, as one of his early paintings was included in the Norwegian pavilion, we don't know whether he ever saw the mummy.
My own view is that the picture simply portrays his feelings of turmoil and despair that form such a major part of his work.
It forms part of a series of paintings he worked on for a decade, which he eventually called the Frieze of Life. Outpourings of emotion onto canvas, both the hopeful and uplifting seeds of love, as well as the more downbeat passing of love, anxiety, and death. and Munch himself later acknowledged the personal anguish behind the painting. For several years I was almost mad. I was stretched to the limit. Nature was screaming in my blood. After that, I gave up hope of ever being able to love again. It was Munch's despair at this time that was highlighted by a fellow painter and writer, Christian Skredsvig, who was with him in Nice in 1892. In his memoirs, he wrote that Munch's despair came from the realization that he was different from other people in the way he experienced the world, and that he was therefore destined to a life of loneliness. Munch had a difficult start in life. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was 5, leaving him, his 3 sisters and a younger brother in the care of their much older father, a doctor driven by a humorless death and damnation religiosity that left a dark shadow over the entire family. His aunt Karen came to live with the family, but Edvard was closest to his sister Sophie, and when she died 9 years later, also of tuberculosis, the shadow deepened. I inherited 2 of mankind's most frightful enemies, the heritage of consumption and insanity. Illness and madness and death were the black angels that stood at my cradle, he wrote in his journal. Munch experimented with different styles in his early paintings, from realism to impressionism, but received extremely hostile reviews in Norway. A portrait of his youngest sister Inger was dismissed as pure gibberish by one newspaper, which said the public was being bamboozled. Another described the seated figure as a physical entity with no trace of life and expression, as untrue in the form as in the colour, of such a low artistic value that the artist's presence at the exhibition itself is difficult to defend. His father's death in 1889 was a turning point for him. At the time, he was living in a small room in Saint-Cloud in Paris, barely a sou to his name, drinking heavily, hallucinating from too much cheap absinthe. But he declared a new direction for his art. There should be no more pictures of interiors, of people reading and women knitting. There would be pictures of real people who breathed, who suffered, felt, loved. I felt impelled. It would be easy. The flesh would have volume. The colours would be alive. And he had loved and suffered in his passionate affair with Millie Taulo, the flirtatious wife of a distant cousin. Their meetings in the woods for al fresco frolics left him ecstatic, but impossibly churned up. And when she ended it after 2 years, he was desolate. 2 of his most celebrated images, Vampire and Ashes, portray his complex I love her, I hate her feelings for Millie. And life didn't really get any easier. He had another difficult relationship with Tulle Larsen, which ended with him shooting himself in the hand, several admissions to sanatoriums and mental hospitals, and an unhealthy reliance on alcohol. Although he eventually received recognition as a major figure in modern art, he lived out his life in virtual seclusion until his death in 1944.
But that's the story of his life, which I'll leave for another day. This is the story of his painting, or paintings.
During the Nazi occupation of Norway, Munch feared that his paintings would be looted or burned as degenerate art, so he bequeathed them to the city of Oslo in the hope that they would be better protected. And it is in Oslo that the vast majority of his works have remained. The 1893 Scream is in the National Museum, and the later version in the Munch Museum, both bucket list destinations for any serious fan of modern art. Amazingly, both painted versions have been stolen. The 1893 version was removed from the National Gallery in 1994 on the opening day of the Lillehammer Winter Olympics, the thieves leaving a note saying, "Thanks for the poor security." The gallery refused to pay $1 million ransom, but the culprits were eventually caught and the painting recovered undamaged. 10 years later, The 1910 version was stolen from the old Munch Museum in broad daylight by masked gunmen along with his Madonna. The culprits were brought to justice, but the paintings remained missing for over 2 years before eventually being recovered with minor damage. The paintings, as they are on cardboard rather than canvas and in mixed media, are particularly fragile, and other than the round-the-world tour in the 50s, have seldom travelled. So, if you want to see them, a trip to Oslo is the only way, as I did with my family a few years ago.
That's it for the Scream, but watch out for the full biography of Edvard Munch, which will be coming out soon. Thanks for watching. As always, I'd love to hear your views and your interpretations of what the picture is about, and any suggestions you may have for other works of art with a mental health theme. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.